Welcome to Myths of the Night. Ancient stories told in whispers to guide you into calm and peaceful rest. Here, the myths of old are retold in calm voices to help you rest, reflect, and dream. In the shadowed halls of Greek mythology, where gods meddle in mortal affairs and fate weaves its inexorable patterns, there exists a love story so devastating, so utterly consuming, that its echoes have reverberated through the centuries. This is not a tale of gentle romance or bittersweet parting. This is the story of Jason and Medea, a romance forged in magic and betrayal, sealed with blood, and ultimately drowned in a grief so profound that it would shatter the very foundations of what we understand about love, loyalty, and the terrifying depths of human emotion. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back to an age when the world was younger and wider, when the edges of maps dissolved into mystery and the unknown. Picture the ancient kingdom of Colchis, nestled along the coast of Thessaly, where the Aegean Sea lapped against rocky shores and the mountains rose like sleeping giants against the horizon. Here, in this realm of heroes and ambition, our story begins not with love, but with usurpation, with the theft of a crown, and the slow-burning ember of vengeance that would one day consume everything in its path. Jason was born to be a king. His father, Jason, was the rightful ruler of Colchis, a just and beloved monarch whose reign promised peace and prosperity. But power, as it so often does, attracted the hungry gaze of those willing to seize it by any means necessary. Peleus, Aeson's half-brother, harbored ambitions that festered in the darkness of his heart. Through treachery and political maneuvering, he wrested the throne from Aeson, casting the rightful king into the shadows of his own palace, a broken man stripped of everything he had built. Fearing for his infant son's life, Aeson made the agonizing decision that would shape Jason's entire existence. Under cover of night, the baby was spirited away from the palace, carried through moonlit forests to the slopes of Mount Pelion, where dwelt Chiron, the wise centaur renowned throughout Greece for his knowledge and noble character. There, far from the poisonous intrigues of court, Jason would be raised and educated, learning the arts of war, the wisdom of philosophy, the healing properties of herbs, and the songs that could move even stones to tears. The years passed, and Jason grew into young manhood beneath Chiron's patient tutelage. He became strong and skilled, his body hardened by mountain climbs and combat training, his mind sharpened by endless discussions of ethics, strategy, and the responsibilities of leadership. But always, always, there burned within him the knowledge of his stolen birthright, the throne that should have been his, the father who had been robbed of his dignity and power. When Jason finally descended from Mount Pelion, he was no longer the helpless infant who had fled into the night. He was a hero in the making, determined to reclaim what was rightfully his. The journey to Iolcus would prove fateful in ways Jason could never have anticipated. As he crossed a swollen river, he lost one of his sandals in the rushing waters. This seemingly minor mishap would prove to be the fulcrum upon which destiny would turn. For years earlier, Peleus had consulted the oracle at Delphi, seeking to know what threat might unseat him from his stolen throne. The oracle's response had been cryptic, yet specific. Beware the man with one sandal. When Jason strode into Iolcus, water still dripping from his remaining shoe, the other foot bare, Peleus felt the cold finger of prophecy touch his spine. But Peleus was cunning, a master of manipulation, who had not held his usurped throne through kindness or fairness. Rather than striking Jason down directly, which might have sparked rebellion among those who still remembered Aeson's just rule, Peleus conceived a plan so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that he was certain it would result in Jason's death far from Greek shores. He would send the young man on a quest for the Golden Fleece. The Golden Fleece was no mere legend whispered in taverns. It was a genuine artifact of tremendous power and significance, the skin of a divine ram that had once rescued 2 children from sacrifice. The ram had flown across seas and mountains to the distant land of Colchis, at the furthest eastern edge of the known world, where it had been sacrificed and its golden fleece given to King Aeetes. There it hung in a sacred grove, guarded by a dragon that never slept, its teeth capable of transforming into fully armed warriors when planted in the earth. Many heroes had attempted to claim the fleece. None had returned. Jason, young and burning with the righteous fury of the dispossessed, accepted the challenge. But he was no fool. He understood that such a quest would require more than individual courage. He would need companions, warriors whose names would be remembered for generations. And so, Jason commissioned the building of a ship unlike any that had sailed the wine-dark sea. A vessel crafted by the master shipwright Argus, constructed from timber cut on Mount Pelion itself. The prow was fashioned from oak taken from the sacred grove of Zeus at Dodona, imbued with prophetic power, capable of speaking warnings to those who would listen. Jason sent out the call, and they came. From every corner of Greece, the greatest heroes of the age answered his summons. Hercules, whose strength was legendary even then, the twins Castor and Pollux, masters of horsemanship and boxing, Orpheus, whose music could charm even stones and savage beasts, Atalanta, the huntress who could outrun the wind, Peleus, who would one day father Achilles. These and dozens more assembled in the port, a gathering of such prowess and fame that poets would sing of them for millennia. They called themselves the Argonauts, after their magnificent ship, the Argo. And when they set sail, the very waves seemed to bow before their passage. The journey to Colchis was an odyssey in itself, filled with adventures and perils that would have broken lesser men. They encountered the Harpies, foul creatures that plagued the blind prophet Phineus, and drove them away with the help of the winged sons of the north wind. They passed through the simple gates, the clashing rocks that crushed ships attempting to navigate between them, surviving only by sending a dove through first and following in the brief moment after the rocks separated. They faced storms that threatened to swallow them whole, and visited strange islands where customs and dangers were unlike anything they had known. But finally, after months of struggle and loss, the Argo glided into the harbor of Colchis, and Jason's eyes beheld the distant kingdom where his fate awaited him. Little did he know that on that same day, in the palace overlooking the sea, a young woman named Medea was also staring out at the horizon, her heart restless with an undefined longing, her powerful mind troubled by dreams she could not quite remember upon waking. Now we must turn our attention to Medea, for her story is every bit as extraordinary as Jason's, perhaps more so. She was no ordinary princess. In her veins flowed divine blood, for she was the granddaughter of Helios himself, the sun god who drove his chariot across the sky each day. Her father, Aeetes, was a formidable king, a sorcerer of considerable power who had transformed Colchis from a welcoming kingdom into a realm that murdered any foreigner who dared to enter its borders. Her aunt was Circe, the enchantress who would one day transform Odysseus's men into swine. Medea had inherited the family gifts. From her earliest years, she had shown an aptitude for the magical arts that surpassed even her father's considerable abilities. She was a priestess of Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, crossroads, and the dark moon. She knew the properties of every herb that grew in field and forest, could brew potions that healed or poisoned, could invoke the ancient powers that most mortals feared to even speak of. In Colchis, she was revered and feared in equal measure a woman whose knowledge and power made her untouchable, unreachable, isolated in her brilliance. But power and knowledge could not fill the emptiness that Medea felt growing within her. She was her father's daughter, obedient and skilled, performing her duties as priestess with precision and devotion. Yet some part of her, some wild and restless spirit, yearned for something she could not name. She would stand on the palace walls at sunset, watching the sun, her grandfather, descend toward the western horizon, and feel a strange melancholy settle over her like a cloak. Was this all there was? Rituals and magic, her father's paranoid xenophobia, the endless cycle of seasons in a kingdom that had closed itself off from the world? When news reached the palace that a Greek ship had entered the harbor, Aeetes flew into a rage. Another group of thieves come to steal his treasure, the Golden Fleece that hung in his sacred grove. He would set them impossible tasks, as he always did, and watch them die, as they always did. The fleece would remain where it had always been, and these strangers would feed the earth with their blood. It was the way of things, the order he had established. Medea accompanied her father to greet these doomed foreigners, her face a mask of cool indifference, her role to stand silently as a symbol of Colchis's power and mystery. She expected nothing from this encounter except the tedious certainty of watching more foolish men march toward their deaths. But when Jason strode forward to address her father, when his eyes met hers for the first time, the entire world seemed to shift on its axis. What is it about certain moments that brands itself into our souls? What alchemical reaction occurs when two people look at each other and feel the universe reorganize itself around them? Jason saw a woman of devastating beauty, yes, but more than that. He saw intelligence burning in her dark eyes, saw power in the straight line of her shoulders, saw something wild and magnificent that called to something equally wild in his own spirit. And Medea felt as though she had been struck by lightning. For the first time in her life, the sorceress who commanded spirits and bent natural law to her will found herself completely, utterly helpless. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Her breath caught in her throat. The world around her, her father's voice, the assembled courtiers, the palace itself, all of it faded into meaningless background noise. There was only this stranger, this Greek hero with eyes the color of storm-tossed seas, whose very presence made her feel as though she had been sleepwalking through her entire life and had only now awakened. But this was no simple case of love at first sight, no innocent meeting of kindred souls. The gods, ever meddlesome in mortal affairs, had taken a direct hand in arranging this catastrophic attraction. Hera, queen of the gods, had her own reasons for wanting Jason to succeed in his quest. She bore a grudge against Peleus, who had offended her by not honoring her properly in his sacrifices. What better vengeance than to see the usurper's plot fail spectacularly? And Hera knew that Jason could never succeed without help from someone who possessed intimate knowledge of Colchis and its dangers. So Hera had gone to Aphrodite, goddess of love, and together they had conspired. Aphrodite commanded her son Eros, the mischievous god who carried arrows that could make anyone fall helplessly in love, to strike Medea's heart the moment she laid eyes on Jason. And Eros, who delighted in causing chaos, had obeyed with enthusiasm. The arrow had pierced Medea's heart in that instant of first sight, and with it came a love so powerful, so all-consuming, that it would override every other consideration, every loyalty, every rational thought. Medea tried to fight it. Gods, how she tried. That night, alone in her chambers, she paced like a caged animal, arguing with herself in the darkness. This was madness. This stranger was her father's enemy, come to steal from her homeland. She owed him nothing, nothing but the loyalty any daughter owed to her father. She should let nature take its course, let him attempt the impossible tasks Aeetes would surely set. Let him die as all the others had died. But even as she formed these thoughts, her treacherous heart rebelled. She saw Jason's face in the dancing shadows cast by her oil lamp. She heard his voice echo in her mind. The very thought of him dying, of those eyes closing forever, of that magnificent spirit being snuffed out, caused her physical pain, a wrenching agony in her chest that made it hard to breathe. This was love, yes, but it was love as a disease, love as possession, love as a force that cared nothing for reason or righteousness or the natural order of things. She consulted the sacred texts, searching for any way to break the spell that had been cast upon her. But the more she read, the more she understood the terrible truth. This was the work of the gods themselves. She, who commanded spirits and bent nature to her will, was powerless against divine intervention. She could either help this stranger and betray everything she had ever known, or she could refuse and face the unbearable torment of watching him die. it was no choice at all. Her sister Chalciope complicated matters further. Chalciope's sons had sailed with Jason and the Argonauts, seeking adventure and glory. Now, they too would face whatever deadly trials Aeetes devised. Chalciope came to Medea's chambers in tears, begging her younger sister to find some way to save her sons from their grandfather's wrath. Here was the excuse Medea needed, the justification that would let her act without admitting the true reason. She could tell herself she was saving her nephews. She could pretend it had nothing to do with the Greek stranger, whose face haunted her every waking moment. The next day, Aeetes announced the tasks Jason would have to complete to claim the Golden Fleece. First, he must yoke the Chalcotoroi, two massive bulls with hooves of bronze and breath of fire, gifts from the god Hephaestus himself. These were no ordinary beasts. Their flames could melt stone, and their strength was such that no mortal had ever managed to harness them. Jason would have to yoke them and use them to plow a field. Second, he must sow the plowed field with dragon's teeth, the same teeth that had spawned an army when Cadmus had planted them in Thebes. From these teeth would spring the Spartoi, fully armed warriors born from the earth itself, mindless and violent, programmed to attack any living thing they encountered. Jason would have to defeat them all. And finally, if by some miracle he survived both of these trials, he would have to face the Colchian dragon that guarded the Golden Fleece itself. This serpent never slept, its eyes burning with eternal vigilance, its scales harder than any armor forged by mortal hands. It had fangs the length of swords and venom that could kill with the merest touch. Many had attempted to steal past it. Their bones decorated the grove. The Argonauts were devastated. These were not tasks. They were elaborate executions designed to give the appearance of fairness while ensuring death. Hercules, strongest of all mortals, shook his head grimly. Even he doubted he could withstand the bull's fiery breath. Orpheus touched his lyre, but could find no notes that might charm such creatures. They all knew they were witnessing Jason's death sentence. But that night, as the Argonauts held a somber council on the Argo, a messenger arrived, one of Chalciope's sons, sent by Medea with instructions. Jason was to come at dawn to the temple of Hecate, alone. There he would meet someone who could help him. Jason, grasping at this single strand of hope, agreed immediately. In the pre-dawn darkness, Jason made his way through the still sleeping city to the temple. It was a place of shadows and strange scents, of whispered prayers to the dark goddess of crossroads and transformation. And there, waiting for him in the dim light of a single lamp, stood Medea. She had not slept. Her eyes showed the ravages of her internal war, but her voice was steady when she spoke. She told him she could help him survive the tasks. She had magic at her command, knowledge that could turn impossible challenges into merely difficult ones. But she demanded something in return, and here her voice faltered. Here the cool mask of the sorceress cracked just enough to reveal the desperate woman beneath. She would help him, save his life, betray her father and her kingdom, but only if he swore an oath. He must take her with him when he left. He must marry her. He must pledge his life and loyalty to her as she was about to pledge hers to him. Jason, perhaps not fully understanding what he was accepting, perhaps too focused on survival to consider the future, agreed immediately. He swore by all the gods, by the river Styx itself, the most binding oath a mortal could make. He would marry Medea. He would take her to Greece. She would be his wife, honored and cherished, until death itself parted them. In that moment, in that shadowed temple, their fates were irrevocably intertwined. Medea produced a small vial of ointment, explaining its properties with the precision of a master craftsman describing her art. This was the charm of Prometheus, a salve of unimaginable potency. Jason was to anoint his entire body with it, every inch of skin, and also his weapons and shield. For one day, it would grant him supernatural strength and invulnerability. The bull's fire would wash over him harmlessly. Their horns would not pierce him. He would have the power to complete the first task. For the second challenge, she gave him more specific instructions. When the Spartoi warriors erupted from the earth, he was not to engage them directly. Instead, he should throw a large stone into their midst. These earth-born soldiers, mindless and aggressive, would not know where the stone came from. They would turn on each other, believing themselves attacked by their fellows. They would fight until they destroyed themselves. And for the final task, the dragon, Medea promised she would be there herself. She would brew a potion, a sleeping draught so powerful that even a creature that had never known rest would succumb. She would put the guardian to sleep, and Jason could take the fleece while it slumbered. She told him all of this in a voice that remained mostly steady, though Jason, looking closely, could see her hands trembling. This was not easy for her. Every word was a betrayal of her father, her people, her entire life up to this moment. But love, that most tyrannical of emotions, left her no choice. She had chosen Jason over everything else, had selected the unknown future over the familiar present, had gambled her very soul on a stranger's oath. The day of the first trial dawned bright and hot. The entire court of Colchis assembled to watch, expecting entertainment, expecting to see this arrogant Greek burned to ash by the divine bulls. Aeetes sat on his throne, a slight smile playing at his lips. The bulls were already in the field, their bronze hooves striking sparks from the stones, smoke and flame gushing from their nostrils with each breath. Jason strode onto the field, and those who knew him, the Argonauts watching with their hearts in their throats, noticed something different about him. He moved with a confidence that seemed almost supernatural, his steps sure, his shoulders straight. When the bulls turned their massive heads toward him, when they pawed the ground and prepared to charge, he did not flinch. The bulls attacked. Twin streams of fire, hot enough to turn sand to glass, roared toward Jason. The crowd gasped, certain they were about to witness his incineration. But the flames parted around him like water around a stone. He stood in the inferno untouched, his skin unmarred, his hair not even singed. The ointment was working. With movements almost casual in their ease, Jason walked up to the first bull, seized its bronze horn, and forced its massive head down and to the side. The creature, accustomed to nothing being able to withstand its might, found itself physically overpowered. Jason fitted the yoke around its neck with the practiced ease of a farmer handling oxen. The second bull met the same fate. In minutes, he had them harnessed and was plowing the field. The supernatural strength gifted by Medea's magic, making the task look effortless. The crowd was stunned into silence. Aeetes' smile had vanished, replaced by a scowl of fury and disbelief. This was not supposed to happen. This stranger was not supposed to succeed. But there was nothing the king could say. He had set the tasks and sworn that anyone who completed them would receive the fleece. He could not break his word publicly without losing all honor. When the field was plowed, Jason took the bag of dragon's teeth and began sewing them in neat rows. As soon as each tooth touched the earth, it began to transform. First, a helmet would push up through the soil, then a spear, then shoulders encased in armor, then the rest of a fully formed warrior. They rose by the dozens, then by the hundreds, an army sprouting from the ground like some grotesque harvest. The Spartoi oriented on Jason immediately, recognizing him as the only other living being in their field. They began advancing, shields locked, spears raised, a wall of bronze and death marching forward with mechanical precision. The Argonauts shouted warnings, but Jason, trusting in Medea's instructions, calmly selected a large stone from the field's edge. He hefted it once, testing its weight, then hurled it into the center of the advancing formation. The stone struck a warrior's helmet with a resounding clang. That warrior, feeling the impact, immediately turned and stabbed the soldier next to him, assuming he had been struck by a companion. That soldier retaliated, and suddenly the entire formation dissolved into chaos. The Spartoi forgot about Jason entirely, turning on each other with mindless fury. Bronze clashed against bronze. Spears pierced armor. Warriors toppled, turning back to dust as soon as they fell. Within minutes, the entire army had destroyed itself, leaving only a field of disturbed earth and scattered dust where hundreds of soldiers had stood. 2 tasks completed. The crowd's silence had given way to murmuring, then to outright talking. This was unprecedented. This Greek had actually done what no one had ever done before. Aeetes rose from his throne, his face thunderous. He declared that the day was late, that the final trial would take place on the morrow. He was clearly stalling, clearly trying to think of some way to avoid honoring his word. But Medea had seen enough. Her father was a man of twisted honor at best, and she knew with cold certainty that he had no intention of letting Jason leave Colchis alive, oath or no oath. That night, she went to the Argo. She told Jason and the Argonauts that they had to act immediately. That very night. Her father would never give them the fleece willingly. They would have to take it by force and flee before dawn. Under cover of darkness, Medea led Jason and a small group of Argonauts to the sacred grove. It was an eerie place, ancient trees whose branches intertwined overhead to block out the stars. The air was thick with an otherworldly presence, a sense that this was a space where the mortal and divine realms touched. And there, hanging from a mighty oak, glowing with its own internal light, was the Golden Fleece. Coiled around the base of the tree was the dragon. Even in the darkness, its scales glimmered with an iridescent sheen. Its eyes, which never closed, watched their approach with alien intelligence. As they drew near, it raised its massive head, jaws opening to reveal fangs that dripped with venom. A low, rumbling hiss emerged from its throat, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the bones of all who heard it. Medea stepped forward, alone, facing the creature that had killed so many before. She began to chant in a language that predated Greek, words of power handed down from her grandfather Helios, from her aunt Circe, from the ancient magics that governed the world before mortals learned to write. She pulled out a vial and sprinkled its contents on the ground before the dragon. The effect was almost immediate. The dragon's eyes, which had never known sleep in all its long existence, began to droop. Its head wavered. It tried to fight the enchantment, shaking itself, hissing defiantly. But Medea's magic was too strong, her will too focused. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the great beast's eyes closed. Its massive head settled onto the ground. Its breathing deepened into the rhythmic pattern of sleep. Jason moved quickly. He climbed the tree, his hands grasping the fleece. Even through his gloves, he could feel the warmth of it, the almost living quality of the gold wool. He tore it free from the branches where it had hung for so many years, and let it fall to the ground. The moment he did, the grove itself seemed to shudder, as though something fundamental had been disturbed. They ran. Through the darkened city, through the sleeping streets, back to the harbor, where the Argo waited with the rest of the crew already at their positions. Medea climbed aboard, and as she did, she looked back one last time at the palace where she had spent her entire life. She was leaving her family, her home, her identity. She was burning every bridge behind her. But when she turned and saw Jason standing at the prow, the Golden Fleece draped over his shoulders, she felt a savage joy that transcended any regret. She had chosen him. She would face whatever came next with the certainty that she had followed her heart. Consequences be damned. The Argo slipped from the harbor just as the alarm was raised. Lights began appearing in windows throughout the city. Shouts echoed across the water, and Aeetes, roused from his bed by frantic servants, understood immediately what had happened. His daughter had betrayed him. The Greek had stolen his greatest treasure, and they were escaping. Aeetes assembled a fleet with terrifying speed. He knew these waters, knew every current and hidden reef. The Argo was fast, but his ships were faster in these familiar seas. By midday, the pursuit had begun in earnest, and by sunset, Aeetes' lead ship was close enough that those on the Argo could see his face, twisted with fury and betrayal. Medea watched her father's ship gaining on them, watched the gap closing with each passing moment. She knew what she had to do. She had known from the moment she decided to help Jason that this moment might come. But knowing and doing, two different things, and what she did next would haunt her for the rest of her life. The ancient sources tell different versions of what happened next, each more horrifying than the last. In some accounts, Absyrtus was still a child when Medea took him aboard the Argo as they fled. In the most brutal telling, she killed her young brother with her own hands, then dismembered his body and threw the pieces into the sea one by one. Other versions describe Absyrtus as a grown warrior who led the pursuit, and Jason ambushed and killed him on a remote island while Medea looked away. Regardless of which version is true, the result was the same. Aeetes, seeing what floated in the water, understanding with horror what his daughter had done, ordered his ships to stop. He could not leave his son's body parts to be scattered by fish and currents. His pursuit halted as he and his men worked to collect every piece of Absyrtus, to give him a proper burial. By the time they had recovered everything, the Argo was far over the horizon, and the chase was lost. Medea stood at the stern of the ship, watching her homeland disappear in the distance. Blood stained her hands and her clothing. She had murdered her own brother, had committed an act of such unspeakable horror that it defied comprehension. And yet, when Jason came to stand beside her, when he placed his hand on her shoulder, she felt no regret. She felt nothing but a grim satisfaction that they had escaped. Love, she was learning, was not the gentle emotion poets sang about. Love was wild and terrible, capable of transforming a priestess into a murderer, capable of making any crime seem justified if it protected the beloved. The journey back to Greece was long and filled with its own adventures. The gods, offended by the murder of Absyrtus, sent terrible storms to harry their passage. Zeus himself struck the Argo with his lightning, and the ship's prophetic prow spoke aloud, declaring that they must seek purification for the blood they had shed. Only Medea's aunt, the sorceress Circe, could cleanse them of this particular stain. They sailed to Circe's island, and there the two enchantresses met. Circe, seeing her niece's blood-soaked hands, understanding what had been done, performed the necessary rituals. But she looked at Medea with eyes full of both pity and recognition. She saw herself in this young woman, saw what love could drive a person to become. When they left, Circe's blessing was mixed with a warning that neither Jason nor Medea quite understood. Some prices, she told them, are not paid all at once. Some debts accumulate interest over time. They faced the sirens whose songs lured sailors to their deaths on the rocks. But Orpheus, the great musician of the Argonauts, played his lyre with such skill that he drowned out their voices, and the ship passed safely. they navigated the straits where Scylla and Charybdis dwelt, twin monsters that had destroyed countless vessels. They stopped at the island of the Phaeacians, where King Alcinous ruled with his wise queen Arete. It was on Phaeacia that Jason and Medea were finally, officially married. Alcinous had agreed to protect them from any remaining pursuit from Colchis, but only if they were wed. So in a cave lined with purple tapestries, with the Argonauts as witnesses, Jason and Medea spoke the vows that bound them as husband and wife. She wore her priestess robes, still stained from her brother's blood. He wore his hero's armor, the Golden Fleece draped over his shoulders. It should have been a joyous occasion. Instead, it felt almost like a funeral, a sense of doors closing behind them, of irrevocable choices made. Near the island of Crete, they encountered Talos, a bronze giant who guarded the shores by throwing massive boulders at any ship that approached. This was one of Hephaestus's creations, animated by divine power, seemingly invincible. The Argonauts were at a loss for how to deal with such a creature, but Medea studied it carefully. She noticed that it had a single vein running through its body, sealed at the ankle by a bronze nail. This vein was filled with ichor, the golden blood of the gods, and it was the source of Talos's animation. Using her magic, Medea drove Talos into a frenzy, causing him to move so violently that the nail came loose. The ichor began to flow out, and the giant, for all its size and strength, collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, its divine life force draining into the sea. It was another display of Medea's terrifying power, another reminder to all who sailed with her that she was not someone to be crossed. When they finally reached Iolcus, Jason discovered that his troubles were far from over. His father, Aeson, was near death, aged prematurely by the stress of living under Peleus's rule. The usurper king, seeing that Jason had actually succeeded in his impossible quest, was furious and fearful. He refused to honor his promise to return the throne. Instead, he sought ways to have Jason killed, claiming that the fleece had been stolen through treachery, not won fairly. Jason, exhausted from the long voyage and desperate to help his dying father, turned to Medea. Could she do anything? Could her magic restore his father's youth and health? Medea, seeing this as an opportunity to both help her husband and remove the obstacle of Peleus, agreed. She went to Aeson and performed a ritual of extraordinary complexity. She cut his throat, drained all his blood, then replaced it with a mixture she had prepared from rare herbs and her own magical workings. The effect was miraculous. Aeson's white hair darkened. His wrinkled skin grew smooth. He opened his eyes as a man in his prime, restored to the vigor of youth. The demonstration did not go unnoticed. Peleus's daughters, seeing what Medea could do, begged her to perform the same miracle on their elderly father. Medea looked at these women, these daughters of the man who had stolen Jason's birthright, who had sent her husband on a quest designed to kill him, and she saw an opportunity for perfect vengeance. She agreed to help them, but with one condition: they must assist her in the ritual. They must be the ones to perform the actual act that would begin their father's transformation. She told them they needed to prepare Peleus, to cut him into pieces as she had done with certain animals in the demonstration she performed for them. She brewed a potion, one that looked and smelled identical to the mixture she had used on Aeson. She instructed the daughters carefully, telling them they must not hesitate, must not show mercy, for the magic required absolute commitment to work properly. The daughters, desperate to restore their father's youth, believing they were giving him a gift, did exactly as Medea instructed. They cut Peleus into pieces. They placed him in the cauldron with Medea's potion, and they waited for the miracle of restoration that never came. For Medea's potion was not a healing draught. It was nothing but water and herbs, with no magical properties whatsoever. Peleus died in agony, murdered by his own daughter's loving hands, and Medea watched with cold satisfaction. The murder of a king, even a usurper king, could not go unpunished. The people of Iolcus rose in outrage. Jason, who had just reclaimed his throne, found himself exiled almost immediately, driven out by those who could not forgive what Medea had done in his name. The fact that he had not ordered the murder, that he perhaps had not even known what Medea was planning, mattered little. She was his wife. Her crimes were his crimes. They fled Iolcus with their lives, but little else. The Golden Fleece suddenly seeming a poor prize for all they had lost. They wandered for a time, seeking a place that would accept them, a kingdom that would overlook Medea's reputation as a sorceress and murderer. Finally, they came to Corinth, a prosperous city-state ruled by King Creon. Here, finally, they found sanctuary. Creon, for reasons of his own, offered them protection and a place in his court. For 10 years, they lived in Corinth, and these were, by all accounts, relatively peaceful years. Medea bore Jason 2 sons, children who carried the blood of heroes and sorceresses in their veins. Jason found work as an advisor to Creon, using his fame as an Argonaut and his knowledge of distant lands to make himself valuable to the king. Medea kept her magical practices quiet, living as an ordinary wife and mother, channeling her formidable intelligence and will into raising her children. But peace, especially peace built on such blood-soaked foundations, is a fragile thing. And Jason, as the years passed, began to chafe at the limitations of his life. He was a hero, a man who had sailed to the edge of the world and returned with the Golden Fleece. He had been born to be a king. Yet here he was, a refugee dependent on another man's charity, married to a foreign woman whose reputation made him a subject of whispered gossip and suspicion. He looked at Medea and increasingly saw not the woman who had saved his life multiple times, but the reason for his current reduced circumstances. If she had not murdered Peleus, he would be king of Iolcus right now. If she were not a barbarian from Colchis, a known sorceress and murderer, he would be more respected in Corinthian society. The love that had once burned so brightly began to cool, transforming into something else, something that looked uncomfortably like resentment. Medea saw the change in him. How could she not? She who had sacrificed everything for this man, who had betrayed her family, murdered her brother, orchestrated the death of Peleus, all for Jason's sake. She had given up her homeland, her identity, her very soul. And now she could feel him slipping away from her. It terrified her. It enraged her. But more than anything, it broke her heart in ways that no external force ever could. King Creon had a daughter named Glaucs, sometimes called Creusa in some versions of the tale. She was young, beautiful, politically valuable, and most importantly, she was Greek. She represented everything that Medea was not: innocent, respectable, connected to local power structures. And Jason, looking at this young woman, began to see a solution to all his problems. If he could marry Glauc, he would become Creon's son-in-law. He would have a path to real power, to respectability, to the kind of life he had always believed was his destiny. The fact that he was already married to Medea was an obstacle, but not an insurmountable one. He could divorce her. Greek law allowed it. He could send her away, keep the children, and start fresh with a new wife who would bring him status rather than shame. The rationalization came easily to him. He told himself that he was doing this for his sons. They would have better prospects as the stepsons of Corinth's future king than as the sons of a barbarian witch. He was securing their future, making the hard choice that a father must make. And Medea, well, Medea had her magic. She could take care of herself. She had survived before she met him. She would survive after. The fact that he was breaking the most sacred oath he had ever made, the vow he had sworn by the river Styx in that shadowed temple in Colchis, apparently did not trouble him greatly. Or if it did, he pushed those concerns aside, burying them under layers of self-justification and pragmatic calculation. This was about survival, about advancement, about giving his children the life they deserved. It had to be done. When Jason finally told Medea of his decision, he did not have the courage to tell her in private. Perhaps he feared what she might do if they were alone. Instead, he announced it publicly in Creon's court, surrounded by guards and witnesses. He was divorcing her. He was marrying Glaus. He had already made the arrangements with Creon. It was done. Imagine, for a moment, what Medea felt in that instant. This woman, who had given up everything for love, who had committed unspeakable crimes in Jason's name, who had borne his children and stood by him through exile and hardship. She was being discarded like a worn-out cloak, replaced with a newer, more politically advantageous model. Every sacrifice she had made, every bridge she had burned, every piece of her soul she had sold for his sake, all of it rendered meaningless by his ambition and his cowardice. She did not scream or weep, not at first. She simply stared at him, and those who were present later said that the look in her eyes was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen. It was the look of someone whose entire world had just shattered, whose foundational understanding of reality had been ripped away. It was the look of betrayal so complete, so devastating, that it transcended mere anger or sorrow and entered into something far darker. When she finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm. She reminded Jason of his oaths. She recounted everything she had done for him, the impossible tasks she had helped him complete, the brother she had murdered, the miles she had traveled from her homeland, the children she had borne. And his response, his justification, cut deeper than any blade could have. He told her she should be grateful. After all, hadn't she been living in Greece, in civilization, rather than in barbaric Colchis? Hadn't she benefited from Greek culture and learning? As for his oath, well, that had been extracted under duress, hadn't it? Promises made under pressure didn't really count. And regarding her help with the fleece, he pointed out that Aphrodite had made her love him, so she hadn't really had a choice. she couldn't claim credit for actions she had been compelled to take by divine influence. Each word was a knife in her heart, but it was the casual dismissal of everything they had shared that wounded most deeply. He spoke as though their decade together had been a minor inconvenience, as though the love they had shared, the passion that had driven her to betray her entire world, had never really existed. He had rewritten their history in his mind, transforming himself from the grateful recipient of her sacrifices into a magnanimous hero who had tolerated her presence for as long as was reasonable. Creon, seeing Medea's reaction, fearing what such a powerful sorceress might do in her rage, made a decree. Medea was to be exiled from Corinth immediately. She had until sunset the next day to leave the city, and she was to go alone. The children would remain with Jason, to be raised as proper Greek citizens, free from their mother's corrupting foreign influence. Medea begged. Gods, how she begged. She who had never begged for anything in her life, who had commanded spirits and bent nature to her will, found herself on her knees before Creon, pleading for just one more day. Not to stay permanently, she assured him, but simply to make arrangements, to secure a place to go. One day, that was all she asked. Creon, perhaps feeling some pity for her, perhaps simply wanting to appear merciful before his court, granted her request. One more day. But after that, if she remained in Corinth, she would be executed on sight. He made this very clear. Whatever sympathy he might feel for her situation could not override his concern for his daughter's safety and his future son-in-law's peace of mind. That night, alone in the house that would soon no longer be hers, Medea's mind worked with a clarity born of absolute desperation. She had a day, 24 hours, to decide what to do, where to go, how to survive. But more than survival, she needed revenge. The betrayal burned in her chest like molten lead. Jason had taken everything from her. Now she would take everything from him. The plan that formed in her mind was monstrous, born from a grief and rage so profound that it warped her very soul. She would kill them. She would kill Gloss and Creon, destroy the future that Jason had tried to build on the ruins of their marriage. But that alone would not be enough. Jason would survive that. He would mourn, perhaps, but he would rebuild. He was a survivor, an opportunist. He would find another path to power, another kingdom to charm. No, if she truly wanted to destroy him, if she wanted to ensure that he suffered as she was suffering, she would have to take the thing he valued most. Not his bride-to-be, not his political prospects, but his legacy. his sons, their sons, the children she had borne him, nursed at her breast, raised with her own hands. She would have to kill her own children. The thought nearly broke her. Medea paced through the night, arguing with herself, one moment determined to go through with it, the next moment collapsing in tears at the impossibility of what she was contemplating. These were her babies. She loved them with an intensity that rivaled even her love for Jason. How could she harm them? How could any mother willingly murder her own children? But then she would remember Jason's face as he announced his decision to divorce her. She would remember his casual dismissal of everything they had shared. She would imagine him with Glaus, building a new family, having more children, raising their sons to forget they ever had a Colchian mother. The boys would grow up calling Glaus mother, would learn to be ashamed of their barbarian heritage, would become proper Greek citizens who never spoke of Medea except as a cautionary tale. In her twisted logic, killing them became an act of love. Better they die now, by her hand, than grow up to despise her, to be turned into strangers by Jason's manipulation. Better they die than live to see their mother reduced to a wandering exile, powerless and alone. At least this way, they would never know betrayal, never experience the kind of soul-destroying disappointment that was currently tearing Medea apart. Death would be a mercy compared to the life Jason had planned for them. As dawn broke on that final day, a visitor arrived. Aegeus, king of Athens, happened to be passing through Corinth on his way home from consulting the oracle at Delphi. He had heard of Medea's situation, and, knowing her reputation as a powerful sorceress, came to offer a proposition. He was childless, desperate for an heir, and the oracle's prophecy had been frustratingly cryptic. If Medea would come to Athens, if she would use her magic to help him father a son, he would give her sanctuary, a place where she could live without fear of persecution. Medea agreed immediately. Here was her escape route, her future secured. Athens was far enough from Corinth that Jason would not be able to pursue her easily. Aegeus was powerful enough to protect her from any revenge Jason might attempt. She made Aegeus swear a sacred oath that he would shelter her no matter what, that no crime she had committed in the past, or might commit in the future, would cause him to revoke his protection. Aegeus, thinking only of his desperate need for an heir, swore the oath. With her future secured, Medea could now focus entirely on her revenge. She sent a message to Jason, using a servant as intermediary. She had reconsidered her position. She understood now that he had been right to seek a better marriage. She wished to apologize for her earlier outburst and to say goodbye to her children properly. As a parting gift, to show there were no hard feelings, she had prepared presents for his new bride, a beautiful golden diadem and an exquisite robe, items worthy of a princess. Jason, relieved that Medea was apparently accepting the situation peacefully, agreed immediately. He even brought the children to her himself, giving her a few hours to spend with them before they would be taken to the palace to present the gifts to Glauce. Medea held her sons, memorizing every detail of their faces, the softness of their hair, the sound of their laughter. She told them she loved them over and over, and they, too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, smiled and played, innocent in a way they would never be again. When it was time to go to the palace, Medea dressed them in their finest clothes. She carefully wrapped the gifts she had prepared for Glauce, her hands steady, despite the horror of what those beautiful objects would do. For the diadem and robe were no ordinary presents. Medea had spent the entire night working her darkest magic, coating every thread, every gem, with poisons so potent that the merest touch would cause agony beyond imagination. These were not quick-acting poisons. Medea was too skilled, too creative for that. These toxins would seep through the skin slowly, giving Glauce time to put on the gifts, to admire herself in a mirror, to feel the initial flush of pleasure at receiving such magnificent items. Then the burning would begin, a fire that started on the skin, but quickly penetrated deeper, consuming flesh and bone, a pain so intense that death would be a release desperately sought, but not quickly granted. The children, carrying the wrapped gifts, were taken to the palace by a servant Medea had carefully instructed. They were to present the gifts directly to Glauce, to tell her they came with their mother's best wishes for a happy marriage. Glauce, young and naive, probably pleased that Medea was apparently accepting the situation gracefully, would open the gifts right away. And she did. According to the reports that reached Medea later, Glauce's delight at receiving such beautiful presents was immediate. She put on the diadem, settling it carefully on her head, then draped the robe around her shoulders, admiring how the fabric caught the light, how the gold thread shimmered. She turned to thank the children, a smile on her face. Then the poison began its work. The smile froze, then twisted into an expression of confusion, then horror. She reached up to touch the diadem, and her fingers came away burned. She tried to remove it, but it had adhered to her skin. and pulling at it only tore away chunks of her scalp. The robe seemed to tighten around her, the fabric burning into her flesh. She began to scream. Creon, hearing his daughter's cries, rushed into the room. He saw Glaus writhing on the floor, her skin bubbling and melting, smoke rising from her body as the poison did its work. Without thinking, acting only on a father's instinct to save his child, he embraced her, trying to smother the flames he did not understand were chemical rather than actual fire. The moment he touched her, the poison transferred to him. His skin began to burn and blister. He tried to pull away, but found that he was stuck to his daughter, their melting flesh fusing together. Father and daughter died together, locked in that final, agonizing embrace, their screams echoing through the palace until, finally, mercifully, they fell silent. The palace erupted into chaos. Servants fled in terror. Guards rushed about, trying to understand what had happened. The children, who had witnessed this horror, were hustled away, though the images of what they had seen were already burned into their young minds. And someone, amid all the confusion, sent word to Jason. Your bride is dead. Your future father-in-law is dead. And your children delivered the weapon that killed them. Jason raced through the streets of Corinth, his mind unable to fully process what he had been told. Medea. It had to be Medea. But surely she wouldn't use their own children as unwitting accomplices to murder. Surely even she had limits. But as he approached his house, as he saw the door standing open, he knew with horrible certainty that there were no limits. Not anymore. He had pushed her past the point where normal human restraints operated. He burst into the house, calling for his sons. The place was eerily quiet. No servants remained. They had all fled, wanting no part in whatever dark business was transpiring. He ran from room to room, his desperation growing with each empty space. Finally, he came to the inner courtyard. Medea stood there, in the center of the space, and at her feet lay their 2 sons. They were not moving. Their small bodies were still, so terribly still. Blood pooled beneath them, dark and spreading. And Medea stood over them, a dagger in her hand, her clothes stained crimson, her face a mask that showed no emotion at all. Jason's knees gave out. He collapsed, a sound emerging from his throat that was barely human, a howl of pure anguish that contained no words because no words existed for what he was feeling. His sons, his boys, gone. and by their own mother's hand. "Why?" he finally managed to gasp out. "Why would you kill our children? They were innocent. They never hurt you." Medea's voice, when she spoke, was hollow, scraped clean of all warmth. "They were not innocent. They were yours. They carried your blood, your legacy. You wanted to replace me, to build a new life, to have new sons with your precious Greek princess. Now you have nothing. No bride, no dynasty, no heirs. You will live the rest of your days knowing that everything you valued is gone, destroyed by the same hands that once saved your worthless life." "I gave you everything," Jason screamed. "I married you. I brought you to Greece." "You gave me nothing," Medea replied, her voice rising now, the emotion finally breaking through. "I gave you everything. My home, my family, my innocence, my very soul. I killed my brother for you. I murdered Peleus for you. I bore your children and stood by you through exile. And you repaid me by casting me aside like garbage the moment a better option appeared. You broke your oath, Jason. You swore by the river Styx that you would be mine until death. Well, now death has visited us, though not in the way you expected." Above them, the sky darkened. Thunder rumbled though there had been no clouds moments before. And descending from the heavens came a chariot pulled by dragons, a gift sent by Medea's grandfather, Helios, the sun god. It was her escape, her divine extraction from the consequences of her actions. Medea climbed into the chariot, and Jason, seeing her about to escape, lurched to his feet and tried to grab her. But the dragons snapped at him with their massive jaws, keeping him back. He fell again, weeping, begging her to at least leave him the bodies of his sons, to let him bury them properly. Medea looked down at him. This man she had loved more than life itself, and felt nothing but contempt. "You will not touch them. I will take their bodies with me. I will give them a proper burial in the temple of Hera, where they will be honored as the innocent victims of their father's betrayal. You will have nothing, not even the consolation of mourning at their graves." And with that, she commanded the dragons to fly. The chariot rose into the air, carrying Medea and the bodies of her murdered children away from Corinth, leaving Jason alone in the courtyard, kneeling in his son's blood, broken in ways that could never be healed. Medea fled to Athens, as Aegeus had promised. True to his oath, he gave her sanctuary, and eventually they married. She did indeed help him, father a son, Medus, who would later give his name to the land of Medea. But her story in Athens would not end happily either. When Theseus, Aegeus's son from an earlier union, returned to claim his birthright, Medea saw him as a threat to her own son's inheritance. She tried to poison Theseus, but Aegeus recognized his son just in time and stopped her. Once again, Medea was forced to flee, this time taking young Medus with her. She eventually returned to Colchis, or so some stories say, where she found that her father Aeaetes had been deposed in her absence. She used her magic and cunning to restore him to his throne, finally making some small amends for her earlier betrayal. Other versions say she simply vanished, becoming a figure of legend more than a person with a definite fate. But what of Jason? His end was fitting in its pathetic tragedy. He never remarried, never had more children. The death of his sons had broken something fundamental in him. He wandered for years, a shell of the hero he had once been, telling anyone who would listen about his adventures with the Argonauts, living in the past because the present was unbearable. Eventually, he returned to Corinth and to the Argo, the ship that had carried him to glory and doom. It had been pulled ashore years ago and was now rotting on the beach, a monument to past greatness. Jason would come here often, sitting beneath the decaying hull, lost in memories of when he had been surrounded by heroes, when his future had seemed unlimited. One day, as he sat there in the shadow of the Argo, a piece of the ship's stern, weakened by years of neglect, broke free and fell. It struck Jason on the head, killing him instantly. The ship that had made him famous ultimately became his coffin. The gods, it seemed, had a sense of irony. The story of Jason and Medea has echoed through the centuries because it speaks to something profoundly unsettling about the nature of love and the darkness that can lurk within even the most passionate devotion. This was not a romance that failed due to external circumstances or simple misunderstanding. This was a love that destroyed itself through betrayal, that mutated into something monstrous because one partner viewed the other as disposable once she had outlived her usefulness. It's worth noting that the version of Medea murdering her own children appears to have been invented by the playwright Euripides in the 5th century BC. Earlier versions of the myth told different stories. Some said she killed them accidentally while trying to make them immortal. Others claimed the citizens of Corinth murdered the children in revenge for the deaths of their king and princess. But Euripides's version, with its raw emotional power and psychological complexity, became the standard that all later writers followed. Medea has been judged harshly by history, and rightly so in many ways. The murder of her children, at least in Euripides' telling, is an act so heinous that it defies any attempt at justification. No betrayal, no matter how profound, can excuse what she did. Those boys were innocent. They loved their mother. They trusted her. And she butchered them to hurt their father. That is a crime that exists in a category beyond normal moral reckoning. Yet, if we look at her story with some measure of understanding, we can see how she arrived at that terrible moment. This was a woman who had given up literally everything for love. She had betrayed her father, murdered her brother, orchestrated the death of Jason's enemy, all because she loved him with a totality that consumed every other aspect of her identity. She had transformed herself from a powerful priestess and princess into a refugee wife, had borne the whispers and suspicions of Greek society, had remade herself entirely to fit into his world. And after all that sacrifice, after reshaping her very soul for his sake, Jason looked at her and decided she wasn't good enough. She wasn't Greek enough, wasn't politically valuable enough, wasn't innocent enough. The love she had given him, the crimes she had committed in his name, none of it mattered in the face of his ambition. She was disposable, easily replaced with a younger model who brought better political connections. The breaking of his oath was perhaps the final, most crushing blow. When Jason had sworn in that temple in Colchis that he would be hers until death, that oath was not just a promise between two people. It was a sacred vow witnessed by the gods themselves. The river Styx was invoked, which meant that breaking the oath carried divine consequences. Jason had effectively committed perjury before the gods, and Medea, priestess that she was, understood the cosmic significance of that betrayal in ways that went beyond personal hurt. In her own twisted logic, by killing their children, Medea was enforcing the terms of Jason's oath. He had promised to be hers until death. Very well. She would make sure death visited their family, just not in the way he had expected. The children became sacrifices, burnt offerings on the altar of Jason's broken promises. It was a divine punishment for his perjury, enacted by the one person who had the most right to demand satisfaction. None of this excuses what Medea did. Understanding how someone arrives at monstrous acts is not the same as forgiving those acts. Her sons were not guilty of their father's crimes. They did not deserve to die because their father was an oath breaker and their mother was consumed by rage. The tragedy of the story is that innocence provides no protection against the consequences of other people's choices. Those children died because two adults, their own parents, failed them in the most catastrophic ways possible. Jason's crimes are quieter than Medea's, but no less damning. He did not murder anyone directly, but his casual cruelty, his willingness to use Medea and then discard her when someone better came along. His dismissal of her sacrifices as either compelled by the gods or simply what she owed him for the privilege of living in Greece. All of this speaks to a moral vacancy that is repulsive. He was a user, a man who took everything Medea offered and then complained that it wasn't enough. He rationalized his betrayal with arguments that probably sounded reasonable to him. He was thinking of his sons' futures. He needed political stability. The divorce was legal under Greek law. Medea was a barbarian who would understand that Greek customs were different. Every excuse was designed to absolve him of responsibility, to transform his selfish ambition into a kind of noble sacrifice. But at the core of it all was cowardice. He had made promises he had no intention of keeping. He had accepted Medea's help, had allowed her to commit crimes for his sake, had let her sacrifice everything, all while reserving the right to abandon her if something better came along. He wanted the benefits of her love and loyalty without accepting any of the responsibilities that came with it. The tragedy of Jason and Medea is not just one of violence and revenge. It is a tragedy about what happens when love is treated as a transaction rather than a sacred bond. Jason viewed Medea as a tool, useful for obtaining the Golden Fleece and consolidating his early power, but ultimately replaceable. He never truly saw her as an equal partner, never understood that her sacrifices had bound them together in ways that could not be easily severed. Medea's mistake was in loving too much, in making Jason the center of her entire existence. She abandoned herself for him, erasing her own identity in favor of becoming his wife, his helpmeet, his shadow. When he rejected her, she had nothing left, no self to fall back on, no identity beyond Jason's wife. That emptiness, that absence of self, combined with her formidable power and her accumulated rage, created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. The ancient Greeks who first told this story understood something profound about the destructive potential of betrayed love. They knew that the line between devotion and obsession, between loyalty and self-annihilation, was frighteningly thin. They knew that when you give someone absolute power over your happiness, when you sacrifice everything for love, you create a situation where betrayal doesn't just hurt. It destroys the fundamental architecture of your soul. Modern audiences sometimes struggle with Medea because her actions are so extreme. We want our victims to be pure, to respond to betrayal with dignity and restraint. The idea that someone who has been wronged might respond with disproportionate violence makes us uncomfortable because it complicates the narrative. We want clear heroes and villains. Medea refuses to fit neatly into either category. She is simultaneously victim and monster, betrayed wife and child murderer, devoted mother, and filicide. She contains multitudes of contradictions, and that is what makes her so uncomfortably human. Real people, especially people who have been pushed past their breaking points, rarely behave in ways that fit our moral categories. They do terrible things for reasons that make sense to them in the moment, and then they have to live with those choices forever. The story has been retold countless times over the millennia, each generation finding new meanings in the ancient tragedy. Euripides wrote what is perhaps the most famous version, giving Medea a voice and allowing her to articulate her rage and pain in ways that force the audience to confront their own complicity in systems that devalue women's sacrifices. Modern adaptations have explored themes of immigration, racism, and the impossible choices faced by women who love men who ultimately betray them. What makes the story eternal is not just the dramatic horror of a mother murdering her children, though that certainly captures attention. What makes it eternal is the uncomfortable questions it forces us to ask. What do we owe to those who have sacrificed everything for our sake? Is love a binding contract or a revocable privilege? When someone breaks a sacred oath, who decides the punishment? How much of ourselves should we give up for love? And what happens when that love is not returned with equal devotion? These are questions without easy answers, questions that humans have been grappling with since we first developed the capacity for complex emotional relationships. Jason and Medea's story doesn't provide answers. Instead, it shows us what happens when these questions are resolved in the worst possible ways, when every choice leads to greater tragedy, when love curdles into hate and devotion transforms into vengeance. In the end, both Jason and Medea lost everything. Their children were dead. Their love was destroyed. Their futures were ruined. Jason died alone and broken, killed by the rotting remnants of his glory days. Medea survived, but at the cost of her humanity, having committed an act so monstrous that no amount of time or distance could ever wash the blood from her hands. They had both wanted different things from their relationship, and in the end, they both got exactly what they deserved: nothing but ashes and regret. The lesson, if there is one, is this: Love is not a game to be played with calculated moves and strategic retreats. It is not a resource to be exploited and discarded when something better comes along. Love, real love, the kind that inspires people to cross oceans and betray families and reshape their entire lives. That love demands to be treated with respect and honored with integrity. Break it, betray it, treat it casually, and you may find that the consequences are more terrible than you ever imagined possible. Jason and Medea loved each other once, in that temple in Colchis, where promises were made and fates were sealed. That love might have sustained them through any challenge, any hardship, any trial. But Jason's ambition and Medea's rage transformed that love into something poisonous, something that killed everything it touched. Their story is a warning about what happens when we fail to honor the sacred bonds we create, when we treat other people as means to our ends rather than as partners in life's journey. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the choices Jason and Medea made, the paths they chose, the prices they paid. Think about the children who died because their parents loved each other too much, and then not enough, who became collateral damage in a war neither of them could win. And perhaps in the morning, you'll hold your own loved ones a little closer, treat your own promises a little more seriously, and remember that the greatest tragedies are not the ones that happen to us, but the ones we create through our own choices, our own failures, our own inability to see beyond our immediate desires to the long-term consequences of our actions. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of mythology's darkest love stories. If you enjoyed this exploration of Jason and Medea's tragic romance, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more myths to explore, so many more stories of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, waiting to be told. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be gentler than the nightmares that haunted Jason and Medea in their final days.